In the spirit of Halloween, paranormal or not, what is the scariest, creepiest or most unsettling experience of your life? I'm essentially the cause of one of the most unsettling events of my life. Thinking back on it is so strange and mildly disturbing for this situation to happen, but I do more or less understand the nature behind these situations. So I've been a sleepwalker for as long as I can remember. My uncle was babysitting my sister, 3, and I, 4, one night, and at 2 a.m. I came downstairs asking him for ice cream. He could tell I was sleepwalking and answered no and sent me back to bed. Not so creepy. Until, 10 minutes later, my sister came down and asked him the very same question. It was startling for my uncle, but he calmly sent my sleepwalking sister back to bed. About 20 minutes later, my uncle heard footsteps upstairs and assumed one of us was still wandering about the house and went upstairs to check. When he turned around the first flight of stairs, he saw both of us sitting up straight at the top step, eyes closed. As he started up the steps toward us, he heard footsteps again pretty much right behind us and began to walk away from us. We slept by our uncle for the rest of the night and he didn't watch us again. What's most unsettling to me is the possibility that my sister and I were communicating with some entity that night. Or at least communicating with one another, though childlike especially gives me chills knowing we all have some sort of extra communication ability as children. Also why I could live without having my own kids. When I was in elementary school, one day about a third of my hardcover encyclopedia set was stacked vertically in a second refrigerator our family kept in the garage. At the time, only my mother and I lived in our old 3-bedroom house and she said she had no idea how they got there. Neither of us has a history or any incidents of sleepwalking. My mother would never pull a prank as she's a typical first-generation Asian parent. None of my friends would dare pull a prank in my house as everyone was afraid of my mom. Finally, it'd be difficult to sneak into our place as it was an old wooden house and everything creaked. If I ever woke up to get water in the middle of the night, my mom or I would hear it. If someone opened the door, the sound would have immediately woken us up. As a little girl I was really shy. My parents were split so my dad would take me on the weekends. I remember one particular weekend, I couldn't have been 10, it must have been summer because I was wearing a cute little yellow tank top and it had a slit up the back like some styles do. My dad lived a few towns over so it was about an hour's drive. We stopped in this little quaint town that we're both familiar with and I, as I always do, run into this little Raggedy Ann shop to look around. I loved Raggedy Anns and so this was a common occurrence. My dad was locking up the car, parked right in front of the store's entrance. I noticed the guy who I believe owned this shop looking at me strange. Since I was really young it didn't really sink in just what was happening. My dad was still outside, and this guy proceeds to tell me there's a really cool Raggedy Ann doll behind the counter in the back room and he told me I would like her. He put his hand on my back, the part where it was bare skin, and started leading me into the back room. I remember my dad come running in about a minute later, yelling, grabbing me and standing me behind him. My tank top sleeve was off my shoulder I remember noticing later, and my dad pulling it back up. My dad called the cops and I never saw what was in that back room, but I guess it wasn't normal. The guy got arrested on previous attempts on luring young kids in the store. The shop was closed and my daddy is definitely my hero. I remember feeling a slight, awkward feeling of unease, and being so young that it hardly added up to me. But I know that if my daddy hadn't caught on to the weirdness of the situation, something awful would have happened. Growing up, my grandmother had issues. She was getting older, harder to take care of herself, despite all of her children living literally within a 5-minute drive besides us. So after my parents' divorce, my mom and her kids moved in with my grandmother to keep an eye on her. My bedroom door faced the living room and past that, the kitchen. Every night, my grandmother would wake me up when she went to get a glass of water. After a few more years she passed. Cut to a month after her funeral, I am woken up to the sound of running water. I open my eyes and for a minute, I can hear the sink turn on. This happened for a few nights every week for a few weeks until after a while, we all noticed we hadn't heard the faucet turn on in a while. To be honest, it had been kinda comforting hearing it turn on in the middle of the night. I was probably 11 or 12 and was invited to go camping with my buddy and his Boy Scout troop. We were camping out at Ice House Reservoir. Just that name alone sounds straight out of a horror movie, right? It was night time when we turned off the main road, but we still had probably 30 minutes of driving down forest roads before we would reach our site. Shortly before our destination, we saw headlights in the distance. As we approached, we found a semi-truck, no trailer, backed into the woods off the road. Something about it was odd, so we stopped. Headlights were on, and the driver's side door was open, so the inside dome light was also on. The truck may have been running, but I can't remember. The baffling part was that there was nobody around. We called out into the woods thinking maybe a trucker was taking a shit or something, but no one called back. Just an empty truck in the middle of the woods. It was getting late and we still needed to set up camp, so we pressed on. We set up our tents, and gathered around the campfire. Naturally, we all started to share speculations and make up stories about the abandoned semi-truck we stumbled across earlier. As you can imagine, the stories turned dark and left us all a little creeped out. Was the driver murdered and the murderer is still wandering the woods? Is the truck driver a murderer looking for campers to prey on? Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night as every sound got my mind wandering. By the next morning, however, we all seemed to forget about it and went on enjoying our weekend of fishing and camping. On our last morning, we cooked breakfast and packed up. On our way out, we came across the same semi, parked in the same spot. This was so long ago, I can't remember if the lights were still on or if we turned them off before we left the site on our way in for the weekend, but it was clear, the truck was completely untouched, nobody had returned. Since it was daylight, it wasn't as scary, but still puzzling. So, we did what anyone would do in that situation. The scout leaders let us 12-year-olds climb inside the truck, and start it since the keys were in the ignition. We honked the horn and grinded gears. It was awesome. After we had our fun, we loaded back up and headed home. To this day, I still wonder if there was some mutilated body of a truck driver laying out in the forest and now the crime scene has a bunch of 12-year-old fingerprints all over it. I guess we'll never know. I was visiting my friends in Mexico and we were continuing partying at one of their houses after going out. It was only 4 of us, and we walk into a dining room and there is a painting leaning against the wall on one side of the room. My one friend nonchalantly says, "Damn it, this house is haunted, a ghost always moves this painting." And he hangs the painting back up on the side of the wall. We continue partying and periodically 1 or 2 of us walk into the dining room together and sure enough the painting is leaning against the wall. I keep calling bullshit and that someone is playing a prank on me. Except all 4 of us were together the whole time, nobody left the room by themselves. I decided to check for myself and of course there is the painting against the wall. I was seriously shocked, and I go back and tell the others. My German friend begins trembling and stuttering and I can tell he is absolutely terrified. I thought the instance was pretty cool. I swear to this day a homeless man must have continued sneaking in the back door, move the painting, and leave, but I really have no explanation for the event. I was climbing Rendezvous Peak above Jackson Hole. I had my phone in aeroplane mode to conserve battery. I got to the top about a minute and a half ahead of my GF, and was greeted by a crow. It squawked at me, and I squawked back. This went in for about 30 seconds, and I shot a couple photos. We had a conversation of sorts, then it left. I told my GF about it and she said crows don't come up to this altitude. Later I told this story to a friend of hers, a local, who said the same thing, crows don't go up that high. I turned my phone back to normal once we were in town. I was greeted by about 40 texts from my family. My father was in the hospital dying, and I needed to go out of state to take custody of my little brother. I don't really believe in omens, but a lot of people believe crows are messengers of the spirit world. Make of it whatever you want, but I promise it's a true story. My grandmother had a story about my sister talking to a photo of her deceased grandmother, my sister's great-great-grandmother. My sister was only around 3 years old but casually said something about the lady in the photo telling her something. My grandmother said, "Don't be silly, photos can't talk," and then my sister said, "But she told me this." I don't know the details anymore, but it freaked my grandmother out because she was basically left wondering how the hell did she know that?